All right. So I try not to do so much editing in general. I'm like
That's
more
fine.
of a,
Let it loose.
yeah, exactly.
Sounds good.
All righty. So today in the My OCD Care Courage series, I am honored to be speaking with Jennifer Say. So Jennifer Say, for those of you who don't know, is an American author, filmmaker, business executive, and retired artistic gymnast. She was the 1986 USA Gymnastics national champion and a seven-time member of the US women's national team. Her first memoir, Chalked Up, was released in 2008 and detailed the coaching cruelty inflicted on children in the sports of gymnastics. Say also produced the 2020 Emmy Award-winning documentary film Athlete A, which connected the crimes of Larry Nassar to systemic abuses in the Olympic movement. Say began working at Levi, Strauss & Co. in 1999 as a marketing assistant, rising to chief marketing officer and then brand president until, in January 2022, she was asked to leave the company because of her vocal opposition to the extended closure of San Francisco's public schools during the COVID pandemic. Say rejected $1 million severance package so that she could be free to tell her story. She does so in her second memoir, Levi's Unbuttoned. She is a mother of four and now resides in Denver with her family. So obviously that's why I'm very excited to have her on. And, the My OCD Care Courage series is basically this project in that a lot of therapists and people seeking therapy for anxiety focus, and also OCD, focus a lot on how do we reduce symptoms, how do we become less anxious. And I think even though that's really important and what we try to do, I think much more important is how courageous are we becoming, right? And kind of viewing courage as, even in the face of fear, we do the things that we believe are important. And, so for obvious reasons, today we'll be discussing, Jen's courage. So starting from that, I found speaking to a lot of people who I've talked to in this series, I've asked them if they consider themselves courageous. And, I've gotten different responses, but I'm curious, do you consider yourself a courageous person?
I mean, I don't really think about it in those terms, I guess. And I think there's two things. I'm very interested in what you were talking about in terms of OCD. And I've certainly, when I was younger, had some compulsive behaviors. I had an eating disorder. So I can come back to that in a second and how I sort of propelled myself beyond that. But I think it's very related to what you're talking about. But I don't really consider myself courageous. There's 2 points I would make. The first is when I sort of embark on a journey, which requires me ultimately to be courageous in order to persist, I don't really think about the pushback I'm going to get. I'm just sort of like in my own head and thinking about, well, this is so obviously true, I'm going to say it. And I am always sort of astonished by the pushback. And generally at that point, I retreat a little bit, but keep getting attacked. And then that strengthens my resolve. So if I, use the book and Chalked Up, my first memoir, as an example, from my perspective, 20 years after I left the sport, it was so obvious to me that everybody knew there was abuse happening in the sport. Everyone I'd trained with, like, we all knew what was going on. We knew that the national team coach was a serial sexual assaulter. We knew that we were emotionally and physically abused, although we probably didn't have that language for it. It was just sort of normal coaching. And so even though I sort of knew you weren't really supposed to say it, when I sat down to write the book, I was in like a quiet, dark room by myself, and I didn't really think about what the world would think. And I didn't know if I would get it published. So it was like this, one little step at a time. And then suddenly, when it did get published, the pushback was really intense. And I was taken aback. I didn't really expect it. So I don't think about the courage required because I'm not thinking about what the impact would be. I'm just thinking about saying true things.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. And a lot of people spoke about the relationship between courage being fueled by your relationship with truth, right?
Yeah.
All right, go on.
Yeah, that's the thing is it's like I don't know, you can just focus on what you can focus on. So I was just focused on, look, this was very harmful for me. At the age of 40, I was still struggling with the repercussions of this abusive training environment, despite the fact that I was a relatively successful adult with 2 children and a career. I was struggling in myriad ways, self-esteem, all sorts of stuff. And so I just felt it was important to say it because I didn't want other kids to have to go through that. And I thought maybe I could have a little bit of an impact. So it wasn't so much focusing on I need to have courage. It was focusing on what I was gonna do. And that became the priority. So that's the first thing. And then the second point I would make is when you are then faced with the pushback, which happened in both instances when I spoke up about kids needing to be in school during COVID, as well as the abuse in the sport. And then it does require courage to keep going. I think the reason I continue is not so much that I've screwed up my courage, but that I'm more afraid of the alternative. Like fear is a part of it. Like I'm more afraid that we continue to abuse children. I'm more afraid that we lose the right to speak freely. So in a sense, it's fear, not courage, that pushes me forward, I think.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating thing that I've also heard echoed in a number of people who I consider courageous. And it sounds like they have a kind of like a strong or like a very salient moral compass. And they're kind of like, they do see, it's painful for them to not do what they believe is right. So it's almost like not only are we kind of just going towards courage, bravely marching forward, but it's almost like I fear not doing what I think is right. And that's the alternative. Uh-huh.
Well, yeah, I mean, I fear not doing what I think is right because there could be other long-term harms. And not that I sort of overstate my own ability to impact, but I think it takes each of us as individuals. And, I'm only one person. I can only do what one person can do. But if I do it, maybe someone will join me and there can then be a chorus of voices. And then I think there's an overriding sort of like, what are your priorities? And in my case, with the second issue of standing up for children during COVID, my priority has never been money. Now, I did quite well as an executive, but that wasn't my priority. And so when I was choosing between doing the right thing and staying true to my own moral compass or shutting up and taking money, it was a very easy decision for me. But I think that's not true for a lot of people, certainly not a lot of people that choose a corporate path. And I think that's why I always sort of struggled with it a bit, because my priorities were sort of not in line. But what I focused on, one, I always was very I loved the brand, and I do still love the brand and the product, and I felt like it had something good to offer. People need pants, high quality pants that last a lifetime. And I felt that the company did a lot of good in the world and treated employees well. And I was very focused on the people that worked for me and helping them build careers. And so there was a lot in it for me that was great and very fulfilling. But I'm reminded of, I'm sure you know Philip Zimbardo, the Stanford prof who wrote he was at Stanford still when I was there. I don't think he still is. I'm not even sure if he's alive. But he wrote sort of the Psych 101 textbook, and he was a psych prof at Stanford. And after he, I think, was finished teaching full time, he started this organization called Heroes in Waiting. And he really believed firmly that despite all of the evil that he had seen and studied in the world, and he was responsible, I believe, for the very controversial Stanford prison experiment.
Yeah.
He believed that we all could do the right thing when faced with a dilemma if we were sort of prepared to do the right thing. And so it was this program to sort of teach children that when faced with a moral dilemma, you should stand up and do the right thing. And that if you may never be presented with that necessity, but if you are, you need to be prepared to do so, which I thought was really interesting. And I think is probably true. Although there is also a part of me that just believes that the data shows that most people will not, no matter what, that there are a certain, whether we look at, the Stanford prison experiment or myriad other, the Milgram experiment, that there is just a small number of people that will kind of stand up and do the right thing, and that most people will obey orders or stand with the crowd when faced with a difficult situation. But that's why I like what Zimbardo is saying, because maybe we can improve that number if we
100%.
teach.
Yeah, and I think like maybe you could almost think like dispositionally, there are people who like no matter what don't care and they're just going to do what they think is right, and there are some people who are so like risk averse that they're never going to, right? And I think there's like a big chunk in the middle, to likely be influenced to maybe be more courageous, do what they think is right.
I think that's right. No, I think that's right. I mean, look, eventually that group in the middle, which is probably 70, 80%, you probably have 10% on either side. They do usually come around and do the right thing, but they need to see that there's a big enough group to stand with before they do it. So the question is, can you influence them then sooner to stand up? And I think about my having spoken out about gymnastics and the abuse in the sport. Everyone I trained with said, you're a liar, you're a grifter, you're all these terrible things. Why are you doing this? They defended their own abuser. I mean, in a sense, it's like Stockholm syndrome. And yet 10 years later, when it became undeniably true that 10 years later, the, Nassar story broke. And then suddenly everybody said, oh, I always stood with her. She went first. And they literally convinced themselves. It's kind of amazing. People will convince themselves they were always on the right side. Now, what if we could encourage people to kind of step forward sooner? I think there's a lot of evil in the world that could be staved off potentially.
Yeah, and getting back to what you had mentioned, like the kind of the long-term lingering impacts of that abuse you experienced, and how it was important to you to prevent that in others. What was the effect of speaking out about it on the lingering symptoms or the lingering, challenges that you're having about it?
That's a really good question. I think, first of all, as a young gymnast, my childhood was very unusual. I was training 8-9 hours a day. By the time I was, 11 years old, my identity was very much tied to the sport, my self-esteem. And so even as I grew up and I had nothing to do with the sport, I wasn't a judge or a coach, and I had like a normal job and all that. And a lot of people stay connected to the sport. They love the connection to the sport. I still had an identity that was tied to it, even though almost no one who knew me knew really what that was about. And so when that community pilloried me and just dragged me across the internet, it was really difficult. It was very hurtful, because my identity was still very much, even though it was 20 years later, I still had some pride and my identity was linked to it. So to be rejected by that community was difficult. But I will say,
was it more the moms or the gymnasts themselves?
It was everyone. It was my peers, my gymnastics peers who were also grown. And then you had younger gymnasts, you had moms, you had everybody they were protecting the sport. And I think for those who had gone through it, who were, my peers in the sport that were now adults and not participating. I mean, some are protecting their livelihoods, right? They own gyms. They're involved in the sport. They're very invested in protecting the image of the sport, I think, just financially. But that makes it sound more craven than I mean it. I think most people are invested in protecting the image of the sport because their own identity is tied to it. And once you wrestle with what really went on, it's really difficult. Like, you have to kind of go and hit bottom and then come back up versus remembering it in this false way that everything was great. That I think a lot of people want to live in that space of just remembering. One of the comments I got from a friend, she was a friend, was, I just don't understand why you have to focus on the negative. They were also nice sometimes and they hugged us if we hit a routine. Okay, but if a spouse hits you and then hugs you after, he's still an abuser.
Yeah.
And that was the relationship. But it's like they want to remember it in a positive light in their own minds because it's easier in a sense.
Yeah.
And that was what was so interesting about making the film Athlete A, which it is sort of on the surface about Larry Nassar, but the point of the film and what I wanted to achieve was to say that this culture is rife with abuse, emotional, physical, and yes, sexual. And a person like Larry Nassar could only do what he did for 30 years in a culture that kind of looks the other way when all of that is happening. So he is what's the phrase I'm looking for? He's a symptom of the culture. He's not one bad apple. He was the inevitable result of a culture so rife with abuse, if that makes sense. And so as people in my age and maybe one age bracket below me watched the film, they saw themselves in a way they had not before. They saw the emotional and physical abuse as something they had suffered from and continued to. And here's the thing is, if you suffer from that, you're made to feel ashamed of that. There's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
That you suffer from this. And it just is this like vicious cycle. So a lot of people came forward and started telling their stories of abuse. And it was really, these women were in their 30s and 40s and they were like, I never realized it before.
It was after the video, you think, was the turning point?
After watching the film, they were able to sort of connect their experience and go, oh, I was treated that way. I was denied food. I was bullied. I was fat shamed. I was forced to train on injuries. I thought that was tough coaching before, but now I realized that was abuse. And that's a pretty heavy realization.
Yeah, 100%. So it sounds like in the beginning you were pilloried, right? And then ultimately celebrated
10 years later.
10 years later, right? So you had to like really stand your ground, for a long time before people were able to see the truth of your message. So what was,
it was brutal. I mean, at first I sort of, because I was really I was the first person to tell a first person account of what the sport was like. There had been one book before mine by a journalist named Joan Ryan. And of course, everybody dismissed that because they're like, oh, she's an outsider. She doesn't understand. Then mine came and it was like, okay, she's an insider, but she was a terrible gymnast. Who cares if she was the national champion? So like, she's just bitter. Then Dominique Moceanu, who was a 1996 Olympian, wrote one 2 years after mine and said a lot of the same stuff. And they're like, yeah, but she's crazy. Like they always find a way. And so I saw that pattern emerging. And, at first I kind of pulled back and I was very protective of myself. And I said in interviews, this is not an indictment of the sport. This is my experience and we have to be aware. And then after I saw that pattern emerge, I got bolder. And I said, this is an indictment of the sport. Abuse is rampant and it needs to change. But I had to say that for 8-9 years before the world came to see it. But at a certain point, a switch flipped in me, and I was no longer kind of trying to protect myself and my reputation because I saw what those who attacked me were doing, and it was a way to silence me and shut me up. And then I got mad, and then I was like, well, I'm not going to do that.
So it almost had like a snowball effect.
Yeah, exactly.
You maybe like you saw that journalist and was like, okay, someone was able to say something. Yeah. Right. You said your thing. And then it sounds like slowly but surely more and more people said things. And then, you really got that vindication for what you knew all along.
Yeah, exactly. And when Dominique's book came out, which was, I think, 2 years after mine, then I had somebody else to stand with. That also helped when you're not completely alone and you can look at each other and say, we're not crazy. No matter how they come for us, we are not crazy. We know what happened. And throughout it all, I got, despite the vilification and the dragging on the internet. And I should say that, in 2008, 9, 10, social media was relatively new. So I didn't know what to expect. I didn't understand. Now I just dismiss the name calling on social media. But then it was like hard. I didn't really understand the dynamics. I don't think any of us did. But I always got letters and DMs. I literally would get actual letters mailed to me thanking me and that this helped. And so that really helped me also, knowing that it made sense to someone else and helped them feel less alone. But what I came to understand was this resorting to just petty name calling and not engaging the argument, not engaging the facts that I offered. That is the purview of those with no argument. That is a tactic to silence you. Nobody engaged the actual merits of what I was saying. And so you have to just shield yourself against it and ignore it, because that is not sensible. That is not logical. That is not a serious person.
Yeah, and that's almost like when your censor should go out. Like, oh, there's something real here. Because if it wasn't, they'd be like, what are you talking about? A, B, and C. Your points X, Y, Z don't make sense in light of A, B, and C. But instead of like, you're crazy right there. Yeah.
Exactly. No, it's a good point. I think now I know that finally at 54, when they start, because when whoever they are, whoever doesn't want and it's different in most situations, but if there are people that are very much against what you are saying being heard, and they resort to name calling to silence you and to silence anybody else that might come forward, that's when I start to push harder.
Yeah, and I love that you did get letters all along with people supporting you, and I think maybe that's for people who are not who know something and are not ready to say whatever comes of it, even reaching out to those people who have been talking about it is very meaningful, right? Like, you may not be ready to come forward. Okay, fine. But you could help reduce the gaslighting effect that truth tellers that experience, right?
That's a really good point. Yeah, no, it's a good point. It's one of the things I've said, in my so I was kind of redeemed, I guess, around 2018-19 when the Nassar, when Larry Nassar went to prison for life. And then when my film came out, Athlete Day, that really generated more support. It was like, it was on Netflix. A lot of people saw it. It was in the top 5 films for the first 2 weeks it was out. And that really generated. But then, of course, right around the same time as that film came out, I started dissenting about restrictions to children during COVID. So I went from, beloved to hated again in very in very short order. But one of the things I tell people, if you're not ready to take a stand, just defending your neighbor's right to speak out is, even if it's privately, it's so meaningful. Even if you don't agree with them. And I think that was one of the hardest things that I dealt with, is I didn't really have any friends that did that. There were no friends that I had new friends that did.
Yeah.
But of my old friends, no one said, look, I agree with you. I just can't go against everyone right now, but I support you. Or I don't agree with you, but I still support your right to speak out. That was very difficult. But of course, you find a new cohort that is willing to provide support. But I think if you're not ready, lending that support, to your point, is very meaningful for those who are willing to stick their neck out.
Yeah. And it's almost like you can almost see it as like a minefield, where like you have a whole group of people that need to get to the end, right? And you kind of have like sort of a path on how to get there, but the first one needs to go and right, and then take the risk, and then the second person goes in with each one, like a path is open, right?
Yeah, no, I like that visual. And I don't know what, like I said, it's always been sort of unintentional, when it's not like I'm not a person that likes to fight. I'm not like my husband, he'll fight with anyone. He likes to fight.
Right.
That's not me. But as I was looking at the data around COVID and kids in particular, it just seemed very clear to me from the outset that we were punishing children in a way that could have lifelong impacts when they were at little no risk. Now, that's what the data said. There's also the issue of it just being, I think, a moral abomination to restrict children in the way that we did, whether or not they were at risk, give people the choice. So both things just upset me greatly. And I I don't know. At first, the names that came at me, you know, I did, once again, I hadn't fully learned my lesson from the first time. I did try to defend myself against them. And then, you know, I was called a racist and a eugenicist. And then it just became so absurd that I stopped thinking about it. You know, again, nobody engaged the merits of the argument. They
You
just,
saw the same pattern.
oh, for sure. But I
And
don't think
it was easier the second time around, would you say?
No, the second time was worse. It was harder because it was the whole world. Whereas the first time was like this narrow community of the athletic community, primarily gymnastics, but, you know, even more broadly, the Olympic movement, but that's still a subset. The entire world was focused on COVID and COVID restrictions. And in San Francisco, where I lived at the time, you know, deep blue city and a deep blue state. And for whatever reason, views on COVID did kind of end up falling on political lines. I think my husband and I were like the only people in the city willing to say, wait a minute, this isn't right. So no, the second time was much harder. And I lost a lot more. You know, I lost my city. I lost a lot of friends. And, you know, ultimately, I don't work in the company that I worked in for 23 years. So the second time was much harder. But when I started, I thought if I just stay calm and present the facts, people will come to see and come to understand. It's like I underestimated the fear and I'm going to call it propaganda in the world. And I overestimated perhaps my own ability to be convincing if I stayed calm. And I also thought about the situation in gymnastics, and I thought, you know, ultimately people did see the facts, but it did take over 10 years. And so I kind of underestimated the amount of time it would take for the truth to reveal itself.
Yeah. Did you get some encouragement along the way, as you did with like nothing?
Not really. We were a small group. You know, the people that right from the beginning were willing to stand up and say this is harming our children, or, you know, more broadly, lockdowns are wrong and ineffective. I stayed focused on kids because I thought that would be more of a bridge issue. But, you know, other than the small group of friends that I made, no, there was very little support. It was basically the entire world.
Wow. What's it like to be punished for doing what you believe is right? Right? Because like kind of like we grow, like there's this just world hypothesis that like if you do the right thing, you get rewarded, and those people who do the wrong thing will be punished. And it goes against like your like a worldview to be punished doing, you know, what I believe and what you believed was the right thing to do. Like pretty clearly, when you had rich private school kids in school, and you know the kids with less in public school have to do virtual when they don't have internet connection. You know, that seems like a pretty clear problem, right? So pointing it out, like, and you're getting punished for it. What's that like?
It's awful. I mean, I had a really, really incredibly stressful 3 years, you know, and it's terrible. It seems so obvious to your point. Like, how does anybody look at that situation and not see the hypocrisy and the unfairness? I still don't understand it, honestly. It's still sort of beyond me. And it was a really difficult year. I cried a lot, you know, I don't know, but I could not imagine conceding to the pressure to not say and do the right thing. You know, and people ask me all the time, what's wrong with you? Why was this the hill you were willing to die on? And I always am like, children? Like,
right. If there are any hills.
Yeah, like free speech and children is really the hill. Those are the two hills that I ended up dying on. If you can say that I died, I don't think I did. But I don't know, if those don't matter to you, then you probably don't have a hill. And I don't know how you look yourself in the mirror. But, you know, it was a really difficult 3 years. My life is kind of finally getting back to normal. I had my husband the whole time, and we were in agreement and supported each other. And that was enough.
Yeah, and it really highlights the importance of when you're deciding who to have as a life partner, that it's someone who, like, obviously they won't agree with you with everything. I mean, it's nice when they do, but
Yeah.
you know, someone who will be willing to support you regardless because you believe in it. So like picking a partner is very, very important, and do so carefully.
Do so very carefully. And I'm, look, this is my second marriage. I understand that if you don't choose correctly, and it can be very difficult. I was married for 12 years the first time, and I certainly didn't think it was, it's hard to know what to choose on. I would say the two things to choose based on are, will you support each other no matter what? And he and I don't agree on everything. And here's the other one. Do you have fun together? I don't think I prioritized that when I was younger. I was a like dark, moody 20-something, and I liked dark and moody. And at a certain point, dark and moody gets really tiresome. And I think you just need to have a bit of fun together. So my husband and I,
100%.
throughout all of this stressfulness, always had fun together.
Oh, that's so important. Yeah, and I really loved your book because you really, I actually listened to the audiobook, so I even, heard your voice throughout, like really detailing what it was like. And there were so many points at which you could have just said, you know what, there's too much at stake here.
Yeah.
And I have so much incentive to just, keep my mouth shut, and then I could like become CEO, potentially. But you really detailed so nicely, and I was really inspired, to do my own speaking out in my own life, by really, listening to your book, hearing your process. A question I have is, sometimes people talk about, like, yes, I'd be willing to deal with any consequences myself.
Yeah.
However, speaking out will affect my family.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, and I'm curious, like, what would you say to those people who think it's very important to speak out, but recognize, and sometimes true and sometimes not,
Yeah.
there could be consequences for their kids.
There are consequences. Look, I have 4 children, 20, 23, and then 9 and 6, and there's a big difference. And obviously I had 2 in my first marriage and then 2 in my second, and it did impact my family. My older kids were not happy about it. We lived in San Francisco. They were old enough to understand. Obviously, one was in high school, one was in college, and didn't approve, whether or not it's that they disapproved of the message or whether they just disapproved because of a program. Like it was all kind of meshed, and we've sorted everything and it's fine. And so it can be very difficult for your family, but do you want to teach your children by modeling the behavior that you don't stand up and do what you think is right? That seems to me like a dereliction of duty as a parent. And I certainly know some other parents who have said exactly that, but I don't know. I think you're definitely not teaching your kids the Zimbardo way, which is to be heroes in waiting. I don't know. And ultimately I was, whether my kids were able to see it that way or not, I was standing up for them. And don't you want parents that stand up for their children in that way? So, I trust, and we have sort of sorted things since then, and we don't agree on everything. They have their own views and on politics, etc. But I think we can always talk about it. And I would encourage them to stand up and express themselves. They're both artists in terms of what they believe, and even if that's in direct opposition to me, I mean, that's what I want them to understand they need to be able to do. Look, I get DMs from people all the time in corporate America who say, I support you. I mean, these are CEOs who write me and say, I support what you're doing. I just can't stand up and advocate for X, Y, and Z because I am the breadwinner. So there's so much wrong with that statement. First of all, there's an inherent sexism in it because I am the breadwinner too. So you're assuming I'm not as the woman.
Right.
So, but also as a leader, if you're a CEO, if you can't inform the culture and influence the culture and stand up and say what you believe and that there is room for everyone here to say what they believe and advocate for what they believe in their personal lives, then that's pathetic. I mean, I'm sorry. It just is. Like, you're the CEO. Establish the culture
Yeah.
of true inclusivity, you know?
Yeah,
Anyway.
that's such a great point. And that has been my experience in speaking out about something that I found concerning within my field. I spoke to people who were very well established, and once I kind of felt out their opinion on the matter, and very often they did agree with me.
Mm.
And then I'm kind of like, oh, this is great. Like, what are we gonna do?
Right.
Right.
And they're like, oh,
And then
no.
they're like, best of luck, good for you, right? And it's very interesting to kind of see that there are those people living, and in many ways looking happy and doing their thing,
Yeah.
just keeping things to themselves. And I think maybe some people have an easier time with it than others.
You doing the wrong thing. Yeah.
Or not speaking out, or
Yeah.
allowing, yeah, exactly.
It's one thing also to sort of be silent, which I think is bad enough if you see that something is wrong. And then do you find that some of them actually will further and advocate for a position that they don't believe in, which to me seems even worse? Like, I don't know how you live with that.
Yeah, I would say more silence than,
Okay.
Advocacy against something you believe in. But,
yeah.
That I imagine is so much worse, like seeing that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's wild to see what people will do
Yeah.
to avoid consequences, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there were a lot of teachers, for instance, during COVID. I certainly know a lot of teachers who saw and knew and understood that this was really bad for children, but did not want to go up against their own union, which is really sad. Look, I get it. There are consequences. It is really difficult. I tell people all the time, if you're going to stand up and, push back against whatever any mainstream narrative is, prepare yourself, gird your loins. Like, this is difficult, but the alternative is worse. Not doing something is worse. And the fact is if we all stood up and said what we thought, I really do think there's an exhausted but and silent majority that has common sense and sees a lot of the madness. The example I always use is the day after I left Levi's, there was an election in San Francisco, and 3 members of the San Francisco school board were recalled by a margin, like an insanely crushing margin. Like, 3 different members, it was 70 to 75% to recall for each of the 3. That says to me, and it was for sure a repudiation of the fact that they did not get schools open sooner. That says to me that most people agreed with me. Maybe not in March 2020, but by fall 2020. But they showed up at the ballot box, but they didn't show up at the rallies. Imagine if they all showed up at the rallies in November 2020. The schools would have opened.
Yeah.
So they were willing to do it when it was anonymous and they wouldn't be exposed. They were afraid. But again, if we had all showed up, we were the majority, we could have made a difference. And that's what I try to tell people. You can inspire somebody else to show up. And I think this majority of people that just kind of see it and have common sense, we can actually inform what happens.
Yeah. And in my experience, I was talking to, my concern was like the lack of safeguarding for youth gender medicine, and really just like a lack of research, or the misrepresentation of research, and kind of a lot of psychologists, therapists, people in the medical field abdicating their professional duty. And I spoke to a lot of people, and without exception, almost everyone, agree with me either totally or in part, but would also not say anything. But one person did. One person in their own Facebook group, in their own community, a tenured professor, said like, "Hey, there's something going on here. Let's have a discussion." And that was pretty powerful. For me to see that.
Hey, it might be one, but that's a 100% increase, you know?
Yeah.
So if
Yeah.
the two of you keep speaking, then you could get two more, and so on and so on. Like, it does, this is how it starts.
Yeah. And I also think, like, while I think we're at the point where it's kind of already very much realized that there's a problem in the field, I feel like I came in late in the
Uh,
sense that, like, a lot of people were really, like, they went after them before me. Like, I didn't have that experience. People almost
mm,
universally agreed with me. Someone said
interesting.
because I have a very low profile, no one cares. But, like, I didn't really get any pushback. And I was,
I don't think that
yeah,
matters if you have a low profile. I mean,
yeah,
honestly, like when I started COVID dissenting, I had a very low profile. I mean,
right,
I had like, I was the CMO at Levi's, but like on social media, I don't know, I had like 500 Twitter followers or something. Like, I did not have a high profile. It didn't matter. They found me anyway.
yeah. And I think, like, when we talked about the gymnastics to COVID, like, you already got vindicated for the gymnastics thing. You were, you know, you got an Emmy for the documentary.
Documentary.
Yeah. And you could have just, gone off into the sunset, right? And said, like, I was vindicated. I did my part.
Yeah.
COVID, let someone else do that, right? But it almost speaks to the fact that you weren't doing it for the acclaim because you already got that, right? And I think,
Yeah,
yeah,
I definitely wasn't doing it for the acclaim. I mean, anyone who thinks that, that's insane. Anyone who thinks, I mean, I get, even just last night, I don't respond to the name calling. Last night I was in a weakened state and I responded to some of it. Like, this whole idea, what they love calling you now, which, is alt-right, which is
yeah,
lunatic, or right wing. I'm like, I don't even consider that an insult anymore. And then grifter. And it
yeah,
just
right,
shows, it's so stupid. It's just like, you'll throw any name against the wall. Clearly, I mean, I would have made way more money, did make way more money as an executive, and would have made even more unimaginable amounts if I'd sort of shut up and become the CEO. Like, I mean, I don't know if you can call that a grift, but it's certainly more lucrative than what I'm doing now. So
yeah,
it's just so dumb on its face. But so were all the other names I was called. I was called racist. I was called eugenicist. So, like, you have to just sort of laugh at it at a certain point, because it doesn't even have to have any cohesion or logic, or it doesn't have to make any sense. Like, you cannot allow
right.
yourself to be cowed by the silliness of those names.
Yeah, and it seems they're all, like you said earlier, just ways to discredit someone. Like, you're not motivated by what you believe is true, and this is your opinion and the way you see it. No, this is like political ideology, or you're mentally ill. It's all things that take away from the point
It's
itself. Yeah,
it shows such a lack of empathy. Like, it's like they cannot believe that you could actually believe these things. Therefore, you must be grifting, which I think is
yeah,
more revealing about them than anything. And it's like, one of the things I would like to see us able to do, which is completely not available at the moment, is to talk to people that we disagree with and give them the benefit of the doubt that they actually believe what they believe. I mean, I think the abortion debate is so illustrative of this. And I've been pro-choice my entire life. I've sort of kind of moderated that a little bit in the last few years. Still pro-choice, but with restrictions. We'll just leave it at that. But when I
hmm,
listen to the debate on both sides, it shows such a lack of understanding and actually listening and empathy. Like, even as a pro-choice person, I can put myself in a pro-lifer's shoes and understand they truly believe that life begins at or before conception, and therefore this is murder. Like,
yeah. And you're not saying,
what
like, they hate women. Right, you're not,
I,
like, taking those tactics, right? You're kind of
that's
understanding what's behind their opinion and understanding what's behind yours, and, like, okay, let's,
yeah,
this is
let's
where
try. And
we.
like, and I think what's so sad is, unless you actually listen and really understand, you're not even having the same conversation, and so you can't really come to any agreement about how to move forward.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely.
And I
I
think
think
that
that's a
could
great analogy.
be
Hmm.
applied to almost any debate that, you know, we're kind of at a standoff. Like, you know, COVID and kids, like, do people really think I wanted to murder children? I mean, that's so stupid on its face. Give me a break.
Yeah, right.
Why can't it be that you may disagree with me that the way to protect children was to allow them to continue their education. You may
Yeah.
disagree with me, but to actually attribute kind of murderous intentions, it's just so dumb.
You just seem like the type. You seem like the murderous, the child murderous type, I guess. Yeah.
And so you have to just kind of laugh at it, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's very
It is it's a social media environment where the most extreme opinions like get rewarded. Like the likes that people
yeah.
get. You know, if you give just like a very balanced opinion, for the most part, you know, the people who are like very extreme won't like it, and either extremes, right? Because you're kind of giving like a middle path opinion. So like we're really reinforced to give the most hyperbolic versions of our point, because
Yeah.
that's how we get likes, that's how we get followers, and it's like such a weird economy.
Yeah, it is. And I always tried to be very you know, I've always my sort of filter for myself is would I say this thing and how I'm saying it on social media, on Twitter, in an article I write, would I say that to a person in real life? Like, is
Right.
this consistent with who I am and how I would use my voice? And I never yell. I've never yet in 23 years of, working at Levi's and then another 6 before that, I don't think I ever screamed. No one ever heard me raise my voice. Now, I was calm and people knew if I was dissatisfied with work, but I was
Mm-hmm.
always fair and fact-based and diplomatic. And as I wrote the book, I had the chance to kind of go back over my tweet history, which is where I found where I got myself in trouble. And I stand by everything I've said the whole time. I was always very calm. And so in a sense, my voice and the way I express myself is not in line with the algorithm, because I don't go around expressing outrage and calling people names or anything like that. I try to actually kind of be the person that I am in real life. And if I wouldn't say it to you in that manner in real life, then I wouldn't say it that way. And have I violated that from time to time? I'm sure I have in fits of anger, but 98% of the time, I think I'm very consistent with who I am in real life. So,
Yeah. So
yeah.
I wonder if the payoff is going to come and when, because I do think, I think like when we're going to see increasing emergence in child mental health issues, probably specific, and we're already starting to see it, and speech issues in the kids who were both masked and seeing teachers who were masked, like I think will continue to, I think you're going to get your payoff. I think it's really a matter of time when people are able to say like, hey, you had a point. Maybe you'll win a second Emmy if you put out a documentary.
Well, I am making a documentary. I'll talk about that in a second. So
Yeah.
the thing is I think we're actually there for the most part. I mean, there's still sort of a fringe element that will stand by the closures and all of it no matter what. But
Yeah.
by and large, mainstream media, the headlines, are rolling in daily about the mental health impacts, the learning loss, the absentee rates are incredibly high, historically high, because I think we sent the message to kids that they didn't matter, school didn't matter. And so it's not really that surprising now that a lot of them just haven't gone back.
Mm-hmm.
There's violence in the schools. The graduation rates, I think, are going to inevitably come down. I think even for those kids that do graduate, they're not able to read and do math at a basic level. So I think the generational problems are going to be pretty catastrophic. And that doesn't mean every kid, I hate that people are like, oh, my kid's fine. It's like, we see an increase in, if we see a decline in graduation rate, or we see an increase in kids graduating without basic skills of 5%, that's catastrophic.
Yeah, right. And also, like, do you know how averages work and a bell curve, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
So I think we already have some agreement on that. What we don't have is agreement around accountability. That this was not, what most would have us believe, I think, that defended closures and restrictions of children. Well, it was COVID that did it. There's nothing we could have done. It's a really unfortunate side effect of COVID. I don't accept that. I think this was a policy choice that was not made by everyone. We know that certain European countries, for instance, opened their schools most in the spring of 2020, as early as May. And so there are certain people that made catastrophically wrong decisions. Governors like Gavin Newsom, public health officials, they would say they didn't make the decision. And so that's where we stop short. And I think that's really problematic. I think when people have made such catastrophically wrong decisions, they need to be held accountable, and they certainly can't be allowed to make those decisions again. So I think we're a ways from that. Right. I also would argue that the most upsetting and frustrating, there's a lot of blame to go around. I really think the press, I hold a special sort of disdain for the way that the press operated within the context of COVID. I think they really, they failed to sort of live up to the requirements of the Fourth Estate. It was a dereliction of duty. They didn't interrogate the issues at all.
Yeah.
And that's really problematic. And I think that once we have a new crop of journalists willing to challenge what happened, that weren't kind of furthering the false messages in the past, that's when we're going to see people held accountable. But I think that's a long ways away.
Yeah, and one of the people who I interviewed was Ben Ryan, who really identified the very bad coverage on Mpox, or formerly known as monkeypox.
Yeah.
Do you know Ben Ryan?
I know him from social media. I just know who he is.
Yeah, he was Hillary as well, and he's just like, hey, they're misrepresenting the data. All these journalists and even these doctors are really just not saying what needs to be said. And I'm like, I got to interview that guy as well. And it was the first interview for the series. So that's a very good point. So do you have to run soon?
No, I don't. I was going to come back to the thing that we were talking about in the beginning, and the sort of obsessive compulsive behaviors, and because I think maybe you agree. I think eating disorders. I'm doing a hard turn away from what we were just talking about, but I think eating disorders are often related to compulsive behaviors. It's a very compulsive kind of way of operating. You're counting calories, you're weighing yourself compulsively. It crowds out any and all other thoughts, and in a sense, they always say it's a way to. I'll just say this for myself. It was a way to not deal with other things in my life because it crowded everything else out. The counting the calories, the obsessive worrying about weight, etc. And at a certain point in my 20s, after I left gymnastics, I just found that whole way of operating. I suddenly kind of took a giant step back, and I thought, this is really stupid. Like I considered myself a feminist, and yet I was spending all my time thinking about the size of my butt, and I thought my value resided in that, or at least I kind of compulsively focused on that. And I made a decision that if I wanted to kind of be a person that I looked up to in the world, I needed to just move away from those behaviors because they weren't allowing me to do anything else. And so it wasn't a focus on minimizing the compulsive behaviors, but on doing other things that then crowded out the compulsive behaviors, if that makes sense.
It makes 100% sense. And that's what I found when it came to, I had a very specific type of OCD, called sensory motor, where you basically notice, let's say you're swallowing or something like that. And it's supposed to be automatic. So if you keep on focusing something that happens regularly, it drives you crazy, right? But I found that once I kind of got more aligned with what was very important to me, because it was very depressing for me when I knew something was wrong but didn't say anything. Like with each day, I felt like, I was just going along with it, and it just felt depressing, right?
Yeah.
And that OCD, would act up a little bit, and I just released on my YouTube video this whole hour and a half talk about how really, upon speaking out about it, and just general commitment to like values was
Yeah.
so helpful in getting past that. And I think like
Yeah.
a very broad range of behavioral, psychological, emotional challenges are addressed by figuring out like what's actually really important to me. That's going to be more important than
Right.
counting calories. Yeah, that's an
Yeah,
excellent point.
exactly. And then all of a sudden that kind of starts to fade and you're doing all this other stuff. And then suddenly it's just not a concern anymore. And I think you're right. It's almost like attention on reducing the focus or reducing the anxiety. It still keeps you focused on that thing rather than pivoting to something else.
Yeah. Okay. So
You
you're
know?
basically giving the lecture that I gave, because there's this
Oh,
thing like
interesting. Yeah.
perspective memory. And like whenever we have intentions about something, like that's going to be more salient to us, right? So if we have intentions to reduce our anxiety related stimuli are going to just be more available to us. I think if
Yeah.
we have, because we evolved that we focus on what's important, right? With all of the million of stimuli, like we're going to be focused on the things we need to get where we need to go.
Right.
If we view the size of our butt as the instrument by which we could be successful and happy and all these things, like your mind's going to focus on that, because you
Yeah.
have to focus on what's going to get you where you need to go, right?
Yeah.
But if where you need to go is like changing the world, you're going to focus on how do I be honest.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden that becomes minimized. And I think so much of, well, you probably know a lot more about how they treat eating disorders today. I don't really know much about it, but what I've wanted for myself, like I think focusing on nutrition and healthy nutrition, that is not helpful to somebody with an eating disorder. I don't know if that's part of treatment usually, but that just places more emphasis on food. I
Right.
want no emphasis on food. It's kind of like it should be what you were saying about the natural. You should just eat and not think about it. Eat when you're hungry. If you don't eat for a long time because you're really busy, fine. If you eat too much one day, fine. Who cares? I want food to be sort of like a non-entity in my life,
Yeah.
and it really is right now. I mean, I just never think about it,
Right.
and it
You eat
feels
when you're
neat.
hungry. Yeah. Okay.
And if I miss, fine, and if I overeat, fine. None of it matters. It's just
Yeah.
silliness, and I find that a lot of the treatment focuses. It doesn't remove the attention to food.
Yeah, and the truth is we don't have great treatments for eating disorders, right? So like I could, it isn't my specialty, but I do know about it.
Yeah.
There's no like treatment where we knocked it out of the park and we like totally know if we do this, if we give these meds or we do this psychotherapy, we got it under control. That's just not the case,
Yeah.
right? There are therapies that are very much grounded in values-based work, such as acceptance and commitment therapy, where it's very much like, let's live our life of values, and instead of just worrying about, symptom reduction,
Yeah.
or things like that. So there are, I don't know, data on ACT for eating disorders, but I think there's likely is a difference for the severity. Right.
Yes.
Like, I think if it's so ingrained in you,
Yeah.
it also affects your cognitive ability and your physical ability to even do
Yeah.
the things that are important to you. So there's
Yeah.
likely like a point at which it's like very hard to get past it with
Well,
values.
I think there are a lot of people that sort of live in low grade eating disorders all the time. And I
Yeah.
see that, and I look at it as the women of my generation that are constantly sort of, measuring their foods and thinking about their foods and what are they going to eat and when, and is this place that I'm meeting my friends going to have the foods that I can eat? Like, oh, stop
Yeah.
it. It's like,
Right.
I think there's all sorts of new ways that gets expressed now, whether it's like, I don't eat these 12 foods which to me is just another kind of eating disorder and an excuse not to eat very much. And I just didn't want to live in the sort of livable place where food is still a driver for me in my life. I wanted to be able to do other things. And I think a lot of women in particular still live in that place where it's still a dominant feature of their thoughts and actions every day. And that just feels really self-limiting to me and unpleasant. unpleasant way to live. I also think that this sort of obsessive focus on food, whether you're anorexic, bulimic, or even an overeater, I think there's a commonality there in all likelihood, and that it's just like this obsessive focus on what am I going to eat when. Because anorexics are thinking about food all the time. They just don't eat it. I mean, I had a weird thing, which I know a lot of anorexics have, is I cooked all the time.
Yeah, right. They'll be talking about recipes. 100%,
yeah, but I didn't eat it. Anyway, it just feels to me that the way is to sort of focus on the positive and where you want to go instead. If you're only focused on minimizing whatever symptoms are, you only really get so far, and you can kind of contain it and have it be manageable, but that doesn't set you free, really.
100%. And that's definitely, and I'll send you the video of where I really said a similar thing, and I think you're definitely onto something. So what's next for you?
Oh, the only thing I was going to add to that is I think unfortunately now, and I'm sure you see this in some of the work that you do, holding on to symptoms that make you, I'm going to use the term victim, in today's world actually comes with some clout. So I imagine it's really hard to operate in that construct today.
Yeah, it's called like the in ACT, they call it like the wisdom of the symptom, right? Like, you know, our behaviors are motivated to, you know, either to get pleasure or to avoid pain, right? And our behaviors are very much attuned to that.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, in this kind of odd environment that we live in, you know, there's weird incentives going on for, you know, in terms of like the, whether it's intersectional hierarchies or the idea that your opinion really only matters if you're of a particular group. And I think that's why like white people are particularly susceptible to that, because, you know, they've been told that they're really inherently evil, and also that their opinion doesn't really matter because it's informed from privilege. How do I matter again? That's our most important thing as a human being, is like, how do we matter? Okay, become a group that you matter, right? You can't change the color of your skin, but like, what other options are there out there? You know, and I think you figure out, you know, humans find a way, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I have a lot to say on that subject, but I won't say it right now.
So this is going to be your next documentary about this?
So no, not that. My documentary, which is well underway and we've actually finished filming, is called Generation COVID, and it's about the impact of school closures and other restrictions to children. And we speak to a range of kids and families across the country, from California, New York, Connecticut, Colorado, and Portland and Florida and lots of other places. We've got about 10 families, kids of varying ages, who, you know, they struggled. And in some cases, their families made great sacrifices to get them, you know, some degree of normalcy. In some cases, the families really suffered the ultimate catastrophe. I mean, there's one family who lost a child to suicide in the film. But we're not just focused on those outliers. We are more focused on sort of the everyday impacts to everyday kids. And I think, you know, it's been pretty catastrophic, whether a child dropped out of high school or perhaps, you know, from a low income family, we're relying on a sports scholarship, but the public schools didn't have sports and the privates did. And I mean, I could, you know, go on and on. Mental health impacts of isolation, drug use, all of these things. Kids will find community in some way. And if they don't have a positive community in school and get positive feedback from teachers and friends, they will find it elsewhere. And in many instances, they did that in very negative, you know, just reinforcing terrible behaviors. They did it in all sorts of ways. So that's the film. We're finished filming and we're editing now, and hopefully finish in the spring.
So I assume production companies are fighting, or like it's going to be in theaters everywhere.
I don't think so.
Oh, man.
We don't have distribution yet, but you know, in fairness, I haven't kind of gone out and pitched it and tried. But I think it'll be a tough sell, because the focus of the film is the kids and the families, and I really wanted viewers, to hear directly from children, because throughout this whole process, we heard kids are resilient, the kids are fine. And I think when you hear directly from a 16-year-old who absolutely 100% is not fine and had a great supportive family, but just difficult dynamics, I think it's very convincing that not all kids are fine. But we do, of course, lay out the chronology of what happened. And it becomes very clear that there are people that were responsible for keeping the schools closed. So that makes it, I think, a bit controversial.
Okay, and I think, there are plenty of controversial films out there. I think controversy is important.
I do.
Yeah, sometimes you ever find there's a subset of whether it's kids or adults who are oh, I loved the pandemic. It was so great. I didn't want to go out. I got so much more screen time. It almost fed into, the things that they like. Did you have anyone's like that?
A lot of people talk about that in the beginning. Most of the kids say they were super psyched in the beginning. They were like, yay, no school, and we get to be online and we can watch Netflix all the time while pretending to be in school. And every kid in this film, after about 2 or 3 months, is like, this is not what I thought it would be. I am very lonely. And so I think, so they all did start out that way for the most part, what kid doesn't? Oh, I don't have to go to school, I get to stay home. But they very quickly became isolated. They missed their friends. They didn't want to do gym class online or choir online or debate club online. And many became quite depressed. Most stopped doing their schoolwork. And these are kids that some of them were very high achieving students.
Yeah.
And I think, we also just forget about some kids were at home in very bad situations. One young woman who is only 15 or 16 now was left home to take care of her much younger siblings. Her mother worked the graveyard shift. She was home alone with younger siblings and an abusive stepfather. This was not a good situation at all.
Yeah, and of course they were forced to go into their jobs at the pizza store and deliver to the people who are tweeting about how everyone should stay indoors, and then getting
of course.
So I'm very excited for this film to come out and to watch it. And
I think there will be more receptivity now than say a year ago or 2 years ago. So,
yeah, for sure.
But I think it will. The goal is to invite people in and sort of to go on the journey with these kids. And even if you were a person that was incredibly pro closure and pro lockdown, that as you sort of see and understand what happened to real families across the country, that perhaps you can open your mind a little bit and say, okay, maybe this wasn't the best policy because people were harmed,
And I think it has future implications, because it's freedoms forfeited are not quickly recaptured. So it's we need to think very hard whenever the next thing comes along where they're saying okay, now you need to do X, Y, and Z because of this, I think freedom is extremely important, and be careful, giving that up.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I'm a bit of an absolutist on this, and I know there's even people who say, yeah, but if it was far more lethal and far more contagious, I still don't think you have the right to take people's freedoms away. I think if those things were true, people would willingly, separate themselves and protect themselves. So yeah, I agree. I think what's alarming to me and what I hear from younger people, from Gen Z in particular, as well as some on the younger side of millennial, is they actually are very willing to forfeit their freedoms for a sense of safety, which is really the dynamic that is always in place when authoritarians are able to kind of take over. They promise safety in exchange for your freedom. And I think many, and I get a chance to talk to a lot of young people they're in the film, but I also have children of that age group, and I just, they are willing to sacrifice. I don't know how you combat that.
Yeah, well, Ben Franklin says, I think maybe it was in your book, that if you sacrifice freedom for safety, you'll neither have freedom nor safety.
Yeah, and that's what's most alarming to me is I think, and we've seen it growing. This is a whole other subject over the last, 10 to 15 years. And we see the safe spaces on college campuses and all of this. And there's this sort of expectation that you are always safe emotionally, physically. And that I think look, the coddling of the American mind is all about this, but we've weakened children in the process as they become young adults. Although they seem fine with inflicting emotional harm on others now, that I'm not going to get into
for the right
that.
reason. But I think the common thread in all of this is that you need people who are kind of clear-sighted and willing to speak up for things they, are seeing problems with the kids or in society.
Yeah.
And I think most people have good beliefs on it. And I feel like a lot of people don't say anything. Like I have a very smart friend who's like, I have nothing interesting to say on Twitter. I'm like, you tell me interesting things all day, and you don't know what kind of crap there is on Twitter. Like, why do you think? She's like, I guess I just don't want to say things, publicly. But I think, you do a great job at encouraging free speech, encouraging courage. Oh, encouraging, interesting. Courage, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I think you're a great role model. And even if not everyone realizes it yet, I realize it. And I hope our viewers do as well.
That's very nice. Thank you. And good for you for speaking up in your professional sphere. So somebody needs to do it. It will unleash others. Courage begets courage. So.
All right. Amen. All right. Just good.